a widow was picking corn in the field when suddenly, the most advanced harvester in the village showed up. At that moment, the ex-father-in-law suddenly realized that the person operating the harvester was his son-in-law, the one who had been kicked out of the house. At this point, Tony was feeling quite proud. Not only had he bought the first harvester in the county, but he was also making money hand over fist every day. He was so wealthy he couldn't keep track of all the money. The arrogant mother-in-law thought Tony had come back to admit his mistakes. She assumed the harvester was a gift for their family. The daughter agreed with her mother. Seeing her husband so sincere, she immediately decided to forgive him. However, Tony told her it had nothing to do with her. He told her to get lost and not to waste his time. Upon hearing this, the ex-wife's family was stunned. The villagers watching the scene also expressed their disbelief, wondering why they were letting such a good son-in-law slip away. The reason Tony had turned into a wealthy man was because he was actually a time traveler who had been reborn. It turns out, he had originally been a lowly son-in-law. Once he moved in with his wife, all the farm work was his responsibility. Meanwhile, his mother-in-law spent her days playing mahjong with the eldest son-in-law. His wife also despised Tony. After working all day in the fields, he finally had a chance to rest, but his wife kicked him off the bed without a second thought. Tony, however, didn't complain about any of it. The next day, he went to work in the fields as usual, pulling a cart. At that moment, a woman's scream came from the cornfield. The brother-in-law rushed out, disheveled, only to be stopped by Tony. Before Tony could say a word, the brother-in-law quickly threw his coat over Tony's head and started yelling for everyone to come and catch the thief. The widow also rushed out of the field. Seeing Tony wearing the familiar coat, she immediately accused him of having ill intentions toward her. Without asking questions, a group of villagers started beating Tony. At this point, the ex-wife's family arrived after hearing the commotion. The brother-in-law, afraid Tony might tell the truth, picked up a nearby pole and struck Tony on the head. Tony only realized in his final moments that no matter how hard he worked in the family, he would always be looked down upon as a son-in-law. Maybe heaven pitted Tony's situation. In the next moment, a time tunnel opened, a bolt of lightning struck, and Tony found himself back 3 hours before the incident. He was sitting alone in a corner, eating his meal, while his ex-wife's family was casually drinking at the table. At that moment, his mother-in-law snatched Tony's bowl and told him to go work in the fields. Tony, reborn and unable to hold back his anger, immediately stood up, threw away his sickle, and angrily cursed his mother-in-law and her family. Seeing this, the brother-in-law immediately played the good guy, telling Tony to sit at the table and eat, but he was stopped by the father-in-law, who said Tony was only capable of hard labor, that he ate and lived off the family, and still dared to defy them. Seeing this, the wife immediately threatened Tony, saying if he didn't work in the fields, they would divorce. Recalling his wife's actions in the previous life, Tony didn't hesitate and agreed. He turned around and left the house without a second thought. At that moment, Tony remembered he was skilled in cooking, so he decided to borrow money from the village secretary to open a fried rice restaurant. However, the mother-in-law and her family thought Tony was just being impulsive, that he would be back home in a couple of days. But to their surprise, they discovered that Tony had actually opened a fried rice restaurant, and it was a huge success. With the money he earned from selling fried rice, he bought the first harvester in the county.